won't get anything. I won't get any sound here.
Can I do it later? Can I do it later?
Right, can we get everyone back and take your seats, please?
Can we have that side?
Hey?
That side?
Okay. It's a bit dim lighting. It's better on that side, but it's entirely up to you. I'll sit here. Right, we've got another community session, or first community session. James Kilby, one of the event organisers, is doing a short session about, I'm not sure what you're doing it about, but here we go, we're going to find out. Plenty of questions, and it's between now and lunch, so ask some questions, but not too many, I guess. But wait for the sound of plates coming and the knives and forks coming out. Right, take it away.
Okay, thank you. As Nick introduced me, I'm James Kilby, one of the organisers here, but this is a session I put together on my own. I like to do things a little bit differently. I'm sure there's a lot of people from Veeam, the community, etc., a lot of vendors, and I'd just like to do something that maybe they haven't seen before or trigger some thoughts that are a little bit new. So, tiny bit about me. I'm a senior cloud engineer for a local ISP. Primary focus, VMware and supporting stack, including sort of dual ownership of the Veeam stack within our company. Been awarded VMware vExpert for a couple of years for talks like this. If it goes well, I'm hoping for next year, but we'll see. And I was recently awarded Veeam Vanguard status. So, as I alluded to earlier, there's 4 of us in the room. Come and chat to us about what that is. And I've been working with VMware on and off since 2008. Now, I've kept the subject of my talk a little bit quiet, but basically it's around backups and how do you know that you can restore from your backup. So obviously there's a lot of different issues that you might come across, hopefully not at 3 in the morning, with a backup file that you might need. So top of the list, disk URE. So hands up, who knows what one is?
Can I have a guess?
Even the vendors? Unrecoverable read error. It's published by all the manufacturers as to the amount of sectors you're likely to read and how often you're going to come across a sector which is effectively a bad block. I'll explain a bit more on that later. Files missing from the chain. Who's ever gone and had somebody either, I'm running low on capacity, I'll just delete the oldest one. Tape issues. Need I say any more? Who uses tape? Hands up.
Good man.
Hey. Who still uses physical tape, or are they virtual? I feel sorry for you. Exactly. That it's coming back because of that very reason, and I'm sure Mike will explain a lot more about it. CBT. Need I say any more? Who uses Hyper-V in here? Yeah.
Leaving.
Yeah. Well, it was get out anyway, but VMware, we know they've had a number of issues with it. If you're not familiar, change block tracking, it's their method of recording the blocks that have changed since the last backup, presenting that to Veeam, hopefully it being accurate so Veeam can go and get you new data blocks. And there's obviously, where are you storing your backups? Who's ever had a backup array failure or RAID group go down? These things happen. And bit rot. Who's familiar with the term bit rot or bit flip? Okay, some of you. TDUPE, metadata issue. I asked how it's protected against. A number of issues with Windows 2012 where people were storing very large VBKs. I think 2016's got an issue that came out recently. It's something to be aware of. You don't get anything for free in this world.
So what is bit rot?
Bit rot is effectively a bit flip. So where you've written a 1 and when you come to read it, you've got a 0. Most systems can protect against that at a hard drive or potentially even a RAID level or even at the file system, but some can't. So it's about thinking about that when you make your selection of backup vendor, software, the operating system that you use, potentially the file system, potentially the underlying hardware, SAN, etc. The file partition level corruption, we've all had an NTFS volume go bad, but some are better at it than others. And disk controller firmware issues. Who runs vSAN in here? Just the one? How sensitive is it to firmware and drivers? There you go. Sensible man. But I mean, it's a pretty extreme version. But make sure if you're running, no matter what the appliance is, or if you built it yourself, the supported version of the firmware and driver of the appliance. And that's for the OS that you're running. If you do an OS change, make sure that the firmware and driver doesn't need to change as well. Okay. Next one's a really easy one. Notifications. They're important. They won't fix your backup issue, but they'll give you a heads up to know you've got one and you need to do something about it. Now, it could be something as simple as an SMP trap, smart on your disks. Maybe you've got Nagios or something hooked up to either Veeam or the underlying infrastructure for it. Very basic. Email alert. Did your backup complete successfully, or have you got a disk down? You need something. Be ahead of the curve. Catch things early. Notifications, they're usually the last thing that gets configured. And the important one is, if you've made any network or firewall changes, test that this still works. You don't want to know that your notifications haven't been telling you that your backup's screwed for the last 7 days when you really need that file. And that's just not for Veeam jobs. Hardware, everything. You want notifications. Okay, so as I alluded to earlier, URE on the disk. Lovely little shot of a hard drive in pieces there. They're made to insane tolerances. They're spinning 24 hours a day. To get a physical defect in that, these things happen. You also have magnetic media, heads that crash, firmware issues on the controllers. All of this happens. You want a system that can tolerate it, preferably without messing with your data, so that you know you can restore. And I'll talk about some of the ways that Veeam has to protect against some of those problems. Tape. Need I say any more? I've never been a fan. I'm becoming less of a fan, with the one exception, which is, at the moment, it's one of the best air gap backups. Crypto lockers becoming real, and a real issue, not just for your primary infrastructure, but for your secondary, your backups, etc. I've heard rumours of CryptLocker-like software going after Veeam backup files. I don't know if that's real in the real world. Have you guys seen that?
Yeah, there's been a couple of forum posts about people getting attacked like that.
Yeah. That is what I would class as an RGE, a resume generating event. It's not something you want. As I said, oh, sorry, next slide. Computer says no. Sorry. You don't want that. You want to have the systems manage the backup files and the backup chains themselves. So back to your monitoring again. You want to monitor your disk space. You want to do the calculations before you even buy the array or appliance of what you can fit on it. And need I say any more? Not again. I started looking up the VMware KB articles for how many times this has happened. I gave up. There's quite a few. I was just seeing who paid attention. I actually put CBT on the first slide twice.
You just emphasising it.
Well, there was that, but I was going to say that I didn't dedupe it to see who was paying attention. So, mainly VMware issue. I think they're getting on top of it now. I'm not aware of anything in 6.5, but early 6 and early 5, they had some big issues. If you've got an old version, you're bringing it up to date, make sure that you skip the ones that have got problems or apply the appropriate patches. Basically, be aware of it. There's nothing to say that VMware won't introduce another issue in the future. Pray they don't, but be aware and test against it. Now, I mentioned earlier a bit flip or bit rot. You've probably all seen it and don't realise it. This is an example JPEG where that's happened. Now, JPEG is very sensitive to it. It's a lossy format, And a single bit flip can be enough to do that to a JPEG. Now, you can have it and it won't affect your image. You may not even notice it, but there are catastrophic problems like that. It's not really a photo that you want of Mars. To be fair, if NASA were getting that from Mars back to Earth and that was the worst thing that happened, I'm still fairly impressed. Sorry. Again, be aware of it. There are systems in place to protect against it, and I'll talk about them shortly. Next one is one of my favourites. Basically, RAID 5. It's done and dusted. Anyone using it in their backup appliances or even in production? Good. So, I looked up some stats this morning. Seagate, 6 terabyte enterprise nearline array. Went on the manufacturer's website, looked up the URE. It's 1 sector per 10 to the 15. Sounds like quite a lot. But if you had a RAID 5 array with 20 of those disks in it, there's a 38% chance of that array successfully rebuilding before hitting one of those UREs. Now, you're all good people out here. You're not using RAID 5. It still exists with 6, it's just the numbers are better. And 26 terabyte disks, you're probably not likely to build. It's going to take a long time to rebuild anyway, even if you did have it. So just try to use it as an example of how bad it's got to nowadays. And you need the mechanisms in place to protect your data all the way through the stack. Obviously, if you want to go exagrid, they're doing RAID 6, I think you said earlier. Good. 10 or 60 is preferred. It's about breaking it down into smaller RAID sets. And if you've got it, RAID scrubbing. A lot of them will do proactive checks to go and go through the checksums on the array. If you can schedule it, run it during the middle of the day. Your backup array is likely to be fairly quiet, so it's not going to do you any harm. Now, as I mentioned earlier about bit rot, it can occur in many different ways. When I was researching it on SSDs, number one cause, they reckon, is actually caused by cosmic rays. It was a surprise to me, even as a physicist. Disk, whether it be SSD or disk, they've got internal protections. None of them are perfect. Tape, they always do it right, and then they read what they've written to the tape to make sure it's good. But that's in the same drive that wrote the tape. You can have issues where the device that wrote the tape, wrote the data, quite happily read it, try and put it in another drive, you've had either a head misalignment or something issue, you can't restore that. These things are difficult to deal with. And memory. In the same way that SSDs are affected by cosmic rays, memory can be too. Make sure you've got ECC and error correction throughout the system. Now you might be thinking, SSD, cosmic ray, yeah, what's he on about? The number of cosmic rays going through every one of us right now is about 10 per second. The example I gave is there's a detector in Italy looking for exactly this sort of stuff for deep particle study. They built the detector about 800 meters underground and it's facing down. So the particles they're looking for have gone all the way through the Earth and then hit the detector. That's enough to move a couple of electrons in an SSD that will change it from a 0 to a 1 or a 1 to a 0. It could be enough to make you have a very bad day. Now, I've sort of alluded to this, but you need end-to-end sort of protections in place. And one of the other issues is file or partition corruption. Now, preferably, you want to use a journal file system. REFS, Veeam's got some great integrations for it now, so if you move into 2016, I would suggest using nothing else. If you're still on anything else, Windows-based, NTFS, ZFS, BetaRFS, etc. You want something that in the event that, let's say you lose power, your appliance goes offline, it's going to recover in a clean way. Now, it's not just the only place you're going to get issues. Firmware, drivers, SATA card, HBA, NICs maybe. Be aware of it. Now, I talked about CBT. to be honest, there aren't many protections against it. If you know you've been running a version, the safest thing to do is perform an active full. Now what that's going to do is it's going to annoy your primary array because you're going to have to go and read every block again, but it's the safest thing to do. One of my recommendations when I'm designing stuff within Veeam is size the jobs with the assumption that you may need to do this in the future. Now that's not just by how long the active job might take. If you've got 100 VMs in it, you've got potentially to pull 100 VMs off your live production array without impacting your live production. But it's also about sizing your backup repo that you might have an active full in there that you weren't expecting. So you obviously get better dedupe by having more VMs in the job, but just bear in mind that you may need to go back to this at some point. And VMware especially, the CBT issues were usually triggered with disk resize. So if you've got a static environment, you're probably safer than most people. But I know certainly where I work and where I've worked in the past, disks can and change size on a regular basis. Safest course of action, perform active full. Is it required? Probably not. Now, I've alluded to a lot of errors that you might see, but I haven't really told you how you can protect against some of them. Now obviously Veeam love their 3-2-1 rule, and you obviously want data in two different systems, preferably with one off-site, sorry. Now, data in two different systems is better than one, but it's no good if I've just got some bad data and copied it. Don't worry, Veeam thought of that. 9.5 introduced something called health checks on the backups. And what that does is it will run CLC checks for the backup metadata and then hash checks for the data blocks. This is quite an intensive process on your backup array and can take quite a long time. I'm not saying don't do it, but in the same way that I said size your backups with the assumption that you might have to do an active full one day, size your backups that you might want to get that check done periodically without affecting your next backup run. So if you can, depending on your backup window, you might have from 8 in the morning till 10 at night to do that. I've seen one of these that took 3 days to run. Didn't want to cancel it, but just be aware of it. Now, that one's very easy to implement. It's literally a tick box and a schedule. Feature request for Veeam. If you could randomize this somehow for multiple jobs, that would be great, rather than me trying to have to do it manually. We can only ask. But how else can you be sure? Well, I didn't dedupe this one. Sure backup. It's one of the best features I think Veeam ever did. And I also think it's probably one of the least used features. Hands up, who's used this in production? Okay, 2, 3, 4. Okay, good lads. For the people that are not using it in production, have any of you got a good reason why?
Pig to set up.
I'll get to that.
It's a lot better now.
Is that it? Just difficult to set up?
Time it takes to set up and educate the customer. I think it's more probably on that.
Okay, cool. Right, I wished I could do a live demo, but I tried it, it took too long, and yeah, the Wi-Fi in here isn't great. So I've got some slides, and I kind of run you through an example setup. This is from off my home lab of verifying some domain controllers. Now, it's split into two really. You've got your virtual lab, and then Sure Backup, and you need to set the lab up first. And what the lab provides is effectively an isolated network, and Veeam deploys a virtual machine into your infrastructure, which joins that isolated network back to your production network in a way where you can spin up your production VMs in the isolated network, and they can communicate to each other, but they don't know they're not on the production network. Once you've done that, the application group set up, and then the final step is to create a Sure Backup job. Now, as alluded to, and Nick said earlier, it used to be fairly tricky. I think it's got better, but it's still not the most intuitive thing to set up that Veeam ever did. Now, one of the things I've loved about Veeam, ever since I started using it, I think it was in 6.5 days, was that it was fairly easy to set up and fairly clear what was going on. Now, this one's always been a bit harder, and I think that puts some users off using it, but it's worth it. Support are great. Bear with it. It'll be worth it in the end. So, sorry, let me just go back. So the first thing you need to do is create a virtual lab. Just give it a boring name, and I've selected a host and a data store for the lab to live on. It's as I said earlier, it's a small sort of effectively proxy virtual machine. So I've configured that. I'm using the proxy appliance, and I've asked it for the production network where I'm going to sit it on. So my production network is actually called Veeam network. Nice and original. And I've asked it to get an IP on that network from DHCP and various DNS settings. And I've also allowed internet traffic from the isolated network out through the production network, etc. Now the next thing to set up is the host networking. Now, the basic single host one you would have thought would be the easiest. I've never found it to work particularly reliably, so I've always used the manual configuration on the single host. Now, depending on how big your infrastructure is and the lab that you might set up, this might not be an option for you. You might need multiple hosts. So the box I'm running at home is 32 gig of RAM while I rebuild my lab, and I don't have that much RAM available to spin up the lab VMs. So that might be an issue for you. So perfect world in production, you'd use the advanced multi-host thing. There are a couple of caveats on that. I believe it only works with DV Switch, so if you're not Enterprise Plus, you're out of luck. But maybe you've got a test cluster, or at least a test box that you can restore this stuff to. So this is a kind of a brief walkthrough of single host configuration. So first thing I need to do, network mapping. So the two legs on the virtual machine, I've got my sort of real production network on the left and the lab network on the right, and obviously given it a VLAN, then given it the IP address settings, etc. that I'd like to use. So the appliance IP recommended to use your default gateway in production for that address, and then correct setup. I've got DHCP turned on. The particular VMs that I'm going to restore, don't use that, they're statically configured. But you might have some dynamic machines in your environment. You can obviously set up multiple virtual machines, multiple virtual networks, etc. And this is kind of a one-time setup operation. Once you've done that, the next thing to set up is your application group. Now I've picked the two domain controllers, and in this particular instance, because of short of RAM, I've asked Veeam to only allocate 75% of what's there in the production network. I've asked it to grab those machines off the backups, and I've given it a role. Now, on the right-hand side are some of the example roles you've got. So in this particular instance, both DCs, they also run the DNS server role, obviously domain controller, and they're both also global catalog servers. Now Veeam's nice in that they've pre-built these checks into the application group to ensure that the test, well, it will perform a number of tests once it's spun the VM up. You can also write some of your own, I believe. The other thing to pay attention to, I picked DCs because they're quite easy, but you might have virtual machines that have got dependencies. If you wanted to do Exchange, an example, you're going to have to get your DCs, DNS, etc. up first. So once your application group, virtual lab and everything is set up, you go away, you create a short backup job, you basically join the two things together, and you hit start and wait. And it will power on your lab virtual machine, which provides the networking. Then it will restore the two virtual machines that you've asked into your environment with a different GUID, power them up, and run the selected tests against it. So you can see, in this instance, it actually worked as I would like. Both DCs restored. They heartbeated, which is effectively VMware Tools was running, pinged, so it came up on the correct network, and it ran the scripts that I was looking for earlier, which is these three. So it ran DNS checks against it, did an DNS lookup, domain controller, and verified the global catalog setup. And you can see at the end of it, it's effectively cleaned up everything. It's removed the virtual machines, stopped the virtual lab from running, and took your environment back to sort of steady state, as it were. You can also ask Veeam to leave these machines running and do tests against it. At a previous role with Paul, I actually used this to do a load of test upgrades on the CRM cluster. So I actually tested it, copies of production to ensure that it worked before it was done for real. There's also options to do effectively the checksumming within the virtual machine once it's spun up. So this is one of the file servers I run at home, where this task took best part of 2 hours. So it spun the VM up, it ran through all the CRC checks on the disk to make sure it's happy, and then removed it again. And that's kind of it. Now, it sounds quite complex and there's a lot to do, but there are ways of shortcutting various bits and pieces. Now, I work for a service provider, and at the moment we don't use this against my wishes. And one of the things that we would like to do is automate this. Now, Luca, who's I'm not sure what his job title now is. Yeah, has a great post on how to do this, and what he's done is it will put together a list of all the VMs in the environment, take a selection of them, create a sure backup job, and it verifies that it boots to the point where VMware Tools is running. Now, obviously, it's not as deep as some of the tests that we've got, but it's damn sight better than nothing. So that's kind of next on my list, if I get my wishes. So hopefully I'm not a million miles between you and lunch. So any questions?
When I've set it up before, sometimes the default timeouts are always the PM and the bad statements setting up a shut top left.
Yep.
In your experience, do you leave them at default or do you increase the timeout?
I've tended to. I've not run into this issue recently. I run them on default, but in past versions, I don't know whether the value has changed or whether Veeam is faster at booting bits and pieces. But I have, yeah, or it could be the underlying storage. So I have run into that issue in the past. When I did this lab, it was all on default timings.
I've said the same, where you set it up and then the job times out before it's got anywhere near coming back.
Well, like you said, no, down to storage, and then you back up.
You could always use next good, I guess.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I've got a question. Can you explain the URE bit again with your
Sure.
10 to the 16 or whatever it was?
Okay. You mean the RAID 5 one?
Yes.
Yeah, that was a ship. You get it to one.
That's it.
There you go. Okay. So URE is an unrecoverable read error. So RAID 5 only has one parity disk. It's distributed, but in the event that you lose a disk, you've got to recover off parity and all the other disks to get back to your clean state. So in this example, you've got 20 disks in your array. It's all working happily. You lose one and you go to 19. You get an email alert, hopefully. You go and swap a disk out. You're back to 20, but that 20th disk's empty.
I suppose though, you've got to take into account the rebuild time as well, so obviously we're getting pretty down to
Yep. Rebuild time can be huge as well. It probably is under these conditions. But what I'm trying to say is that the job is unlikely to complete, let alone. So what will happen is this is from the manufacturer, you're likely to get an unrecoverable read error, one sector per 10 to the 15. So if you times that number by, I think there's 20 disks, that's a huge amount of sectors. But to rebuild 19 disks worth of data, or to read them, you're likely to run into that issue where there is a unique block of data that you don't have, that you need that sector to be able to come back to full.
Because you're getting closer to that number.
Well, the more discs and the bigger. So this has come about because discs have got much bigger over the generations, but they haven't become much more reliable. So this figure's generally been fairly stable for quite a while. So the discs have got bigger and bigger and bigger. You're more likely to run into an issue. I mean, you could run into it on a single disc. 1 to 10 to 15, I think, is a... Oh, I can't remember the maths. I can't do it in my head. But it could happen on a single disc. But the more that you put in a specific array in that one group, the more likely you're going to run into that issue, which is why potentially RAID 6 has got 2 places it could go to get its data. 60, you've got sort of mirrors and partners. It's about bringing that group smaller to be able to have less data in to read from, to recover. Does that make sense? Does that make sense to other people as well?
Yeah.
Okay.
Any for questions anymore? No.
CBT. Veeam still have some type of protection, don't they, against CBT issues?
So we obviously leverage that, so we're only taking what we need to back up from.
Yeah.
If we recognise that there are issues with CBT, then we'll take
Full.
We'll have to read the whole file.
Yeah.
Source.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of yes, we have that. We won't just fail the job.
Yeah.
So, but we will have to go and read all of the blocks
If
of production.
you've got a legacy way of doing CBT as well, but you don't have to read all the documents.
No, that's more most of it Hyper-V. We have our own CBT for Hyper-V.
Yeah.
I don't even know if that kicks in on VMware CBT.
So I know if, for instance, the array wasn't cleanly shut down and Veeam picks up an issue with CBT, it will just do a full rescan. And I think it will try and reset CBT as well. So the next pass, it will go back to using changebot tracking.
I think it, on a VMware environment, it has to leverage VMware's changebot tracking, or it does that rescan and check.
Yeah.
We won't use the Hyper-V changebot tracking.
No.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you've got Veeam with either a Veeam backup copy job or Veeam Cloud Connect to
Sure.
a site,
Yep.
could you have Sure backup spin up the VM doing a different site to check your offsite backup copies working?
I don't see why you couldn't. You probably can't with Cloud Connect because you don't have access to the infrastructure suitable bandwidth to pull it back at.
With a backup copy job?
Don't see why not. So in the sort of the first sort of presentation, I picked the cluster and the host that I wanted to be. There's no reason that could be in a different. It can't be in a different cluster or a different data center to your production network. Yeah, I'm not aware of any restrictions on that.
No, that's exactly a use case. Right?
Yeah.
So if you've got a test and dev or a UAT kind of
Or
cluster,
or even a DR site, you might as well spin it up.
So as well as Sure backup leverages the backup files, whether that be backup,
In fact, actually.
job, or the backup copy job, we can leverage that. We also have Sure replica, which is really we're just going to spin up the replicas in the second site, and you can then leave that running, so you can then start running your test and dev in that location as well.
Can you do that with Cloud Connect as well? So
We were just talking about that. I'm not sure. I don't think so.
There's no copy.
I haven't actually got a screenshot.
If you don't have, as a service provider, you should be able to, but then obviously you don't have the credentials.
so it'd be a client run process but against your.
No, it's if they don't see the hypervisor.
Does that determine whether it's unmanaged or managed? Being cloud connected?
Yeah, but I think when you run through the Sure backup job,
You won't be able to select the.
point to a host or a cluster.
Yeah, I've skipped it, but effectively here I've selected my cluster, my host, and I don't think you'll be able to see the service providers.
You literally get access to. Yeah, you don't get the FQDN.
Yeah.
That'd be a great service to offer if someone could offer it.
feature requests across the backyard.
Yeah.
Oh, you ignore my feature requests. Yeah.
Tell Luca.
Yeah, I will do. He loves me.
Get Anton in a headlock.
Yeah. But no, having.
Although he's already heard me anyway.
Yeah. So apart from that, yeah, the randomisation of the jobs, because you don't want all your CRC checks on your backup jobs to run on the first Monday of the month or whatever.
Yeah.
It's not going to be a good day. Okay. Any other questions?
You actually looked at short
Yes, we looked at it. This is another feature request from the Vanguard. Sure Replica doesn't work for where I work because we use VCD. It's expecting vSphere at the back end.
Yeah, you need to have the underlying access. BCD
So,
kills it.
yeah. Yes, we looked at that and then we're like, no, sorry.
It's a missing piece. That'd be really nice.
We could get rid of a certain company probably. That,
We've got support in restore back into.
yeah. You can fully support backup restore into VCD. Even into different VCDs. We know we've done this. It does work. Okay.
Right, we're all done.
I think that's lunch then.
I can smell and hear lunch. So thanks very much. It's a good session. Thank
Hope
you.
that was useful.